And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, now we're not going to talk about that anymore. Mike
Well,
shut that down pretty quick.
listen, I had to do something because we were heading down the same track we did last week. And well, we finally got together to record something, and then we ended up not recording. We ended up just talking about, I didn't even know what it was.
Like fun stuff about one Enoch and the Assumption of Moses.
Right. That was what it was about. Now I remember. So anyway, so I just hit record and we're doing it now, right? I'm throwing you in,
We're in.
and we are now
Talking about David.
can't give up. No, we're not talking
No,
about David.
Frank.
Wrong.
Wrong week.
You weren't here for the David one, I don't think. So that's what
No, Mike got into trouble for the David one.
I think I did.
Did you?
Well,
Did you?
I knew that I would get into trouble because I'm just bound to say something wrong in the sense that doing it's kind of a multi what can we say? There's a lot that
faceted.
Yeah. And
there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah. But that's okay. I'm always willing to learn on those other things. But we want to press on with the mission that we're on. We've come so far. We're not going to give up now. We'll put this in a nice handy dandy playlist forever, so it shall be on the YouTube playlist thing, and that will just be helpful to whoever wants to read the book, so you don't feel like you're doing it alone. And again, it's sort of capturing some of the mantra of what this show is all about anyway. So we're looking at chapter, what is it, 5 now, where we're seeing some of the responses to Kline. Okay. And we've looked at Doyevit's response to Kline and what, my own evaluation and ours by virtue of our discussion here. And likewise, we're going to do the same thing for perspectivalism now, which is one of the big things that, comes into play in the back and forth with Kline and the what do you call it? I suppose, the
dialectic,
the literature, but yeah, the response, I suppose, to kingdom thinking and Kline at the source. One person that has certainly identified that, for better or for worse, is John Frame. He very clearly is one of those guys that have set a large amount of time and space for this issue, and it's sort of driven him along all the way through. So it would be crazy not to talk about him. But at the same time, he is taking a different angle. So we've called it a perspectivalist response because he takes it's very similar to theonomy, but it's not theonomy. It's just coming at it from a different perspective. Excuse the pun. And then you've got it's not neo-Calvin. It's very aligned with neo-Calvinism in some sense, and that vision of Doyevitianism. But it's again slightly different, slightly nuanced. So it's worth and something that Kline and Frame have had back and forth on. So it's worth honing in on. And actually, Kline wrote such a great little article on this. We mentioned that last time, but now we want to focus in more on what the response to something like that might be. Even though I should say that in all of Frame's response, and even that book that he wrote about Two Kingdoms, even the whole chapter he dedicates to Kline, he doesn't ever respond to Kline's little article that I'm sure he knew about. So, that will come in later as we think about this. I don't know. So you guys read the chapter. Andrew read the wrong chapter. So
I did read this chapter. Okay. I have read this chapter. I just didn't. I was revising the Doyevid section this morning.
All right.
So I read the chapter, made notes. Fire happened at the church. Don't have my notes.
You guys sound like you pitched up at class and all we need now.
The dog ate my homework.
Dog ate it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, let me get us started here. Frame's response to Kline, okay, is just uniquely sort of heated from Frame's side. Yeah. Especially, if anything, the heat comes from
it feels personal.
It does feel personal. You've got Kline bringing the heat on the response to theonomy and Bonson, but I think you got more of the heat coming from Frame on this instance, in that you have this kind of deep irony happening. Yeah. In that Frame is known as this ironic theologian, and he's always trying to find the midway ground, and he's always using his perspectivalism, to try and work this out. Except when it comes to Kline and Two Kingdom theology, he's like a hardline theonomist. He like throws all of his perspectivalism out the window, which is kind of weird. On that side of it, anyway. Methodologically, I think you get to the source of why they disagree in many ways. But to start off with, I think what's nice about reading through what is it called again, Escondido Theology, that book that Graham wrote, and chapter 5, I think it was on Kline. He starts off by just acknowledging, listen, Kline is like the most impressive theologian that he's ever encountered, and certainly the most impressive theologian of the Two Kingdom Project, because he's just going there and just saying, yep, that's what it is. And you could see he sort of has a little bit more time. He's stimulated by dealing with Kline, and wants to think it through and wants to know why he's differing. And so I really appreciated that part of reading through everything Frame had to say. On that point,
it does feel like with Kline, I mean, even the fact that he's being accused of creating almost like this, I think the word cult was used.
Yes.
Of following. Now, no one's ever going to accuse me of that. I've never been able to create a cult-like following, anywhere, in any way, shape, or form. But also, even if you think about popular theologians or popular preachers and that kind of thing, the fact that so many people are so convinced that his minority view within the Reformed thing is absolutely on the money, that does speak volumes, I think. There's something there. There's some substance there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And not only from Frame side, but absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned the what is it? You use the not cult. What is it, like sect?
Sect.
There's this kind of Westminster sect thing going on. And again, that I think relates to the personal story. We won't get into it now. Frame does actually detail the
aggressively militant revisionist group.
There we go.
I think was his wording.
Yeah. Funny. Okay, so whoever those guys on campus were, they really ticked him off. Let's put it that way. Those students who were around when Frame was teaching at Westminster, they kind of they obviously were a little bit cage stage Kleinian. Let's put it that way, and got under his skin. And anyway, whatever it was.
What happened?
Well, I was about to say. So he does. He's very open about it and details the whole thing in his, I think, might have been like one of the last books he's written, A Theology of My Life.
Really, that's the one.
Nice read, really good. I mean, I really suggest, it's got many different life lessons there. It's a great book. I want to write a book like that at the end, except I'm not important enough to do it. But it's kind of like just a memoir, a memoir. And he's I love the way he's like, oh, to be honest, I look back on all that was a complete mess. I made a real mistake there. Sorry about that. And he's just he's like, and to be honest,
retractions.
Yeah, we're so humble, So I was very impressed with
that's what we love about. That's what we love about Fred.
Yeah, and and again, very just a helpful, read. I recommend that to anyone. But he does just give a whole, sets the whole stage, and I think in a way that probably Kleinians that were on campus at the time and whatnot wouldn't disagree with, in any extreme way. But it just sort of moved towards understanding where he was at. It was a volatile time. It was, there was a lot of change. It was kind of heated in certain areas. There were some genuine differences that he was experiencing with some faculty members. And eventually it led to him going to RTS rather than, so it was a real thing. And, this stuff happens. But anyways, this is all part of it, and feelings got hurt, and that obviously accounts for some of it in the rawness of his own language. Yeah.
Now, what you do in this chapter, Mike, is you also take Frame and you sort of you heap him together with Bergquist, Elam, and Van Kooten.
Yeah,
the American Moses book.
Yeah, exactly.
They seem to have an overlapping concern.
Exactly. Because one of the things I wanted to do was just go, well, I don't want to give the impression that Frame's just like way off on all of these things and just on his own, and he's just like, complaining without any support in the world. And it might be unfair of me to do that, because I could just say, well, no one's taking that exact position from an exact perspectivalist perspective, and therefore he's the only one doing his thing. But in the attempt to just kind of say, well, let's try and, if there's anything going here, let's see who's supporting Frame and if the concerns are valid. And there's some really outstanding theologians that have joined Frame in the critique, and I think they should be heard along with Frame on these points. And I think they're wrong, concretely so, on some certain certain areas, but still there it is. It's worthwhile.
Well, I think that came out in the book, so I think when you're reading the book, you're getting a strong sense of how much opposition there is. So I don't think you've set a low bar to clear.
Yes.
I think you've put the hurdle where it should be. It shows, if anything, I think maybe gone. It showed actually
a little too ironic.
A little bit too much. Given a little bit too much to the opposition, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I thought a lot of the critiques were sort of typical of 20th century covenant theology.
Yes.
With Murray in the air, and there's a little bit of the traditional things that people would say around the law in general in light of theonomy. There was some sort of predictable critiques that come out of the things that people were thinking and talking about in the 20th century. And so,
right, for me, it's always sort of a bit shot out of the gate when it comes across as, well, that's a revisionist sect, and my view is a more generic Calvinism. For me, I break out in a rash when I hear generic Calvinism, because that has such neo-Calvinistic connotations.
But a lot of people think John Murray is a generic Calvinist.
Well, totally. The all of that sort of stuff is the supposed generic.
He was
Calvinism.
The revisionist.
He was the revisionist. Yeah. So, we want to get to the methodological difference that Frame himself admits, by the way. He's like, we have very different ways of approaching theology, which I also thought, to his credit, there was that, where Frame, he makes the statement somewhere, it does not become the systematician to unravel what is already systematized in scripture, right? We've got the dogmatics guy needs to take what biblical theologian gives him and make that even tighter and firmer and categorize it, even more analytically and logically. Whereas, and that's what that's what Kline's all about. So he's going, look, here it is. Here's this thing that the Bible presents to you. Now, all you got to do is put a bow on it, and Frame is doing the opposite. He's taking the bow out. He's like, no, that's a little too tight, and he likes to, in his own words, keep it fuzzy, right? That very, in fact, he very generously actually pulled up that article for me because I couldn't find it anymore, and had to get into his old computer. So even though I felt a little bit bad, because I'm like, you realize you're giving me the article.
You know what I'm going to do with this.
You're arming me over here.
Yeah. You do understand what this is for, right?
But to Frame's credit, he stands behind that article. He likes it. He chuckled when he's like, I like to keep it fuzzy, because he's all about that. He's like, he wants to. These reformed guys are just so tighty whitey on all these things. So I want to just show them that, hey, actually, there's you might be guilty of a theological solipsism here. So just kind of flex a little bit. Just see that perhaps your argument is not so airtight. And again, I think we've said before, we've always appreciated that about Frame. He gets you thinking. I wouldn't scruple to recommend him as something, to recommend what he's written, because of that point. It gets you thinking like almost no other theologian.
It strikes me that there is something of a groundswell of that kind of way of thinking within the Reformed camp as well. So, like, in other words, of not tightening things down too much. So, in some sense, the kind of biblical theological movement really played on that.
Yes.
When it thought about the downside of systematic theology, because it's basically saying you guys are trying to connect every dot to an insane level. Sometimes you've got to leave the strands open, right? That was one of their big things. Like, don't flatten out the nuances of scripture with systematic doctrine. Keep the highs and lows and bumps and frayed edges there, because that's what how the biblical text is wanting to reveal it.
Yeah.
But you've also got guys like N.T. Rice here in the UK and I guess globally, who's basically it sounds to me like, I mean, he is for me one of the guys where it's just like, what are you saying? What are you actually saying?
Yes, punch it in the face already. Like, what's going on?
I mean, my goodness, put us out of our
Same.
misery and just sum it up for us. But he's just like, he cannot conclude. He cannot land the plane.
Well, and you always get, because that's the hiss of the serpent right there.
But you see that, and that's it. So because his whole thing, it sounds to me, my understanding of his whole thing about the atonement, right, and about reform views of the atonement, is that he's basically saying we've just tried to nail it down too much. Like, so the penal substitution thing, we've been too specific,
too
like, just keep it vague. He died for our sins.
He's probably echoing McGraw's perspective. Alistair McGraw has that perspective. Well,
I think it is a particularly British thing, but I'm saying that actually Frame is within that culture, isn't he? Like, I mean, I know he's probably a precursor to a lot of that, but there's some similarities there, that wanting to keep things vague for the sake of all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, like, in some ways, I mean, like, because I think Frame's methodology is not at all, in my opinion anyway, like any sort of biblical theology in any Vossian sense, right? So maybe there's a weird backdoor sort of connection to a kind of more, generalized biblical theology. Maybe that's true. But it's almost like, one of the reasons I appreciated Kline so much is that he would run this biblical theological thing, but he would not back away from, the systematic theological guys are doing what they should be doing. And so there's all for that as well, and himself systematizing as he goes. It's rare in the world of biblical theology in that way, as you're saying, but it's almost like a Frame, I suppose, while he operates in that same general sort of category, I would hesitate to put him in any kind of biblical theological category. He's more approaching it from a philosophical sort of overriding system.
But he is a little bit biblicist by his own admission.
Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying.
So and at that level, there's correspondence with the same concerns that the biblical theology. I'm thinking,
yes.
I'm thinking of like the Sydney Anglicans, the Aussies,
right,
and their concerns about systematic theology as a methodology for theology, and its inclination to try and go beyond what is written in order to make it logically or coherent to whatever system of doctrine you've got, right? I think there's a similar tendency in Frame at a biblicist level.
Biblicist.
Sorry, Nick,
totally.
I know you're a biblicist too, so I don't mean to offend.
And Nick, same tendency.
Same problem.
Amen. Well, let's get down to Frame's critique.
But just before we go there, I think that is important. With I don't mention the biblicist thing in the chapter enough, I think, because that is a big thing that I think since I wrote the chapter, it has come to view more and more, that is actually a thing with Frame. And I think it's a great point. It's sort of round the back door. It sort of makes the same point that we're making now anyway, in that, just there's a reluctance to move into dogmatics, in quite the same way. But we're saying with Kline's position, in terms of his methodological tension with Frame, I think it does, with Kline, this is where it all comes down to, I think, as far as I can see anyway. They're whether you want to call it from the methodological perspectivalism that's driving it, or his biblicism, one way or another, I don't really mind. But ultimately, that's the thing that keeps them from gelling. He's not willing to run with it, for lack of a better term, So I think we'll see that come through again and again as we go through now. So with that in mind, yes, where did you want to go next, Nick?
So, just the themes that come up in the critique. And so you sort of number them for us. So first, whether it's Frame or Berquist, Elam, and Van Kooten, the Merton Moses book, they reject the law-gospel antithesis in Klinean theology. So
and
so
with
Frame,
they want to see it all as a, basically any idea of republication, they're very unhappy with. It's just got to be a pure administration of grace. So the law-gospel antithesis, don't like. They see that as schizophrenic.
And Lutheran.
And Lutheran.
They join in their critique, and that's not Reformed theology, that's Lutheran theology. You know, and
interesting.
they're quite full on about it. You know, which again is, I don't think it's just not true. You know, it's historically.
But that also isn't. It's an odd critique. It's at a couple of levels. One, because I mean, surely that has to come from a Lutheran. Like a Lutheran has to say, "Hang on, this is Lutheran." But second of all, why is that such a bad thing? Like, why is it so bad if a Reformed guy sounds Lutheran?
Because
like, I realize they're not the same system, but
it's
I mean,
dualism in their mind. It's
okay.
It's capitulating all sorts of like things that are supposed to be antithetical to a pure Reformed recovery of you know, this
right
complete.
And they would probably in their minds see it as a systematic theological category imposition on a biblical theology. Where they'd say, well, there's just a law gospel antithesis, let's just throw it at everything, and you know, Kline's seeing it there, therefore he's reading the Bible like a Lutheran.
Right, there we go.
So the other problem that I have with this, right, is that you know, apart from Kline's own, you know, exegetical challenge to the idea that everything is just one thing, that's both law gospel at the same time. Apart from that, I think that within the own Reformed system, you know, it just sort of, it seems to wreak havoc, because like you're forced to then read things like the Mosaic covenant as gracious, you know, essentially covenants of the covenant of grace, which means that you're basically forced to read the Christian life and its understanding of the gospel and its understanding of reward and its understanding of merit and inheritance and all that kind of thing, the same way that you would read Moses. And this has always been my biggest problem with Presbyterian. Even when I was a Presbyterian, this is what I struggled with most. Like it just seems to wreak havoc. So at the one hand, we're saying, yeah, it's grace and salvation is by grace and it's justification is by faith alone and all this kind of thing. But on the other hand, we're saying, but it's just like the Mosaic covenant. And when I'm reading that, I'm thinking, sure, that doesn't sound like the other thing you were saying.
Yeah, and not just the Mosaic covenant, but the covenant of works before. You know, we're talking about grace before the fall. You know,
oh my
this is the big thing they want to kind of shoot for with, and with Frame. I mean, he's like, we shouldn't talk so much in terms of grace and law and grace, or unmerited favor and, you know, demerited favor or something like that. We should talk law gospel. Yeah, we should talk about characters of grace. We should talk about a kind of, they're all unmerited favor. So there's a kind of unmerited favor before the fall, and then it's just the character of that unmerited favor changes after the fall, and it all is grace. Even though Frame is, you know, in his typical fashion, allowed also, you know, to talk about a law, that idea that characterizes it prior the fall, and there is a significant difference. But yeah, he's, you know, he will leave you with this. Now we've lost. So all obedience in the Christian life is effectively just like obedience for Adam, and it all basically leads to blessing, which is obviously what was being communicated in the Mosaic covenant. You know, that's why if you obeyed, you got blessing in the land, because that's what the Christian life is about. If you obey, you're basically blessed one way or another. If you don't, now it can't, like, those are truisms at some level, you know, but yeah, it just doesn't cut the mustard when you have to look at these texts and you have to see what these cursings are about, and what, you know, when you actually look at the details of the blessings and the cursings, you know, you get into real trouble with it. Like,
I think that is in some ways closer to that view of just seeing one thing is closer to Eastern Orthodoxy, in my opinion.
Yeah,
the way that they talk about the gospel is just basically being a renewed life,
right?
You know, I don't want to, I'm not an Eastern Orthodox expert, so I don't want to go too far down this road. But just the way that I hear them talk about salvation and redemption and theosis, and it does sound very similar to the neo-Calvinists at some level. But anyway,
so in your second point there, you talk about how they don't like Kline's view of merit in the Pactum Salutis. I think you just mentioned that. And so instead of seeing Christ under reprobation and fulfilling the law, that his reward comes by virtue of his status rather than his work. So you highlight that, so that what they do is they change the cost of Christ's obedience, where it's more a case of it's because of who he is that he gets the reward rather than what he does. And so that it rests on his deity rather than his humanity. And so if you draw it away from merit, you have to put the reward, why does the reward come? Why does life come? What does Christ win, and how does he win it? Well, it's because of who he is.
Yeah, they want to stay away from this commercial, transaction, as they put it.
Transaction stuff.
So if you try to downplay the merit aspect, you have to find some other way. And what they do is they create this weird ontological meritorious system where, because Jesus was the God-man, that's why the reward came.
Right.
Which sort of puts a question mark over, well, then why Adam? He was never a God-man.
Exactly.
Also sounds just a little bit, a little bit Nestorian, but that's in the sense that you're kind of, it feels like an arbitrary separation of his person and work on the one level, but also of like who he is in his divine nature versus what he's done in his human nature. Because surely when we're thinking about redemption, when we're thinking about salvation, we're thinking about or him fulfilling all righteousness. Both of those things must be united in his person in the way that he accomplishes it, rather than kind of pulling one apart. No?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Possibly it's because of their it's because of their worry about being Nestorian that they overly mash it up.
Yeah.
So it's because there are a few statements in Murray along those lines where Murray, when he talks about the nature of the righteousness that we receive, with the righteousness of God in Christ, and so he tries to explore that statement through the hypostatic union, because it's the righteousness of the God-man. Therefore, there must be some sort of divine informing of that righteousess, and so. As an attempt to not divide the righteousness overly much, try to keep it all together.
Exactly. Yeah. If we're just saying it's because of Jesus's work as a man, then it's sort of like.
And I think what we're trying to say is that we have to follow Paul in reading the parody of Romans 5.
Right. Yeah. Well put. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and I think with I think what the problem is, on the one hand, it starts well. You start. I mean, you could almost go along with Frame in that he's saying, listen, the danger of this whole commercial transaction business is that you're undermining this like vast blessing that's given to Adam. Yes, you're calling it kindness and goodness, but really think about what's going on there. It's grace. And you're kind of like, okay, I think obviously any appeal to creature created distinction is going to work to some degree. We get that, but you have to say it about Jesus then as well. And that's where you get into trouble, and so basically the high priestly prayer doesn't work anymore. Jesus can't say, I've done what you gave me to do. Now give me what you promised. And now, I enter into that glory that I experienced, which I think is the real lynch point for me, because, you have to reword that prayer almost. You have to go, I really don't deserve anything that you've given me. So by grace, please give me everything that I don't deserve anywhere after having done the things that you told me to do. It's just, that's not what Jesus prayed.
And so what Frame would read that as Jesus' high priestly prayer, basically saying, because of who I am, give this to me.
Yes.
Give this to me, not because of what I've done necessarily, not because I've earned it through my obedience.
But the problem with that is it's a distinctly meritorious grounding that he's calling for there. I mean, that's the whole point of that prayer. Yeah. So it doesn't work.
And the Philippians hymn as well. Yeah.
And their critique, I mean, it seems they're pretty allergic to the whole notion of merit. And the next sort of point that they bring up is because they're Augustinian and Calvinistic, they believe in total depravity, therefore merit is impossible. And to build a theology around the notion of merit is sort of going against your own Calvinistic DNA. So maybe it's worthwhile, discussing the nature of the merit in question. Is it a condign merit? Is it a true merit? Is it a pactum merit? Is it a typological merit? Is it are we saying that there are actually deeds that God was expecting people to be able to do perfectly to actually merit anything and put God in their debt?
Can I just, before we get there, because I think that is absolutely right, but before we get there, can I just ask a question, something that I've wondered about? So when Frame's talking about the grace before the fall thing, right? And obviously Kline is saying no grace before the fall, but there's a sense in which, if I understand it, there's a problem of definition, because frames working on a grace is unmerited favor, whereas Kline's working on a grace is demerited favor.
Yeah, it's a problem of definition, but Frame consciously rejects Kline's definition.
Right. But my question is, why does Frame think his critique lands when Kline is operating on a different framework? Like, so in other words, are we really, I don't see it as a fatal blow to the Kleinian system to acknowledge some kind of graciousness in God that was present prior to the fall. You know what I mean? Well, like a generosity that is undeserved, because in some sense creation was an undeserved generosity. So I don't see that as landing like a vital. I don't see that as landing a blow on the Kleinian system, because Kline's not making that point.
All right. Well, I think Kline is making the point that, I mean, yes, there is. Everyone agrees there's an ontological condescension, right, of God. So that's not even in question now. What we're talking about here is more the salvific condescension, or something along those lines in grace. The very term salvific requires this to have a fall to begin with, right? So demerited and so forth. We're talking about soteriological grace, for lack of a better expression, and let's just limit it to that. Even there, Frame and Kline are disagreeing, and Frame's saying the Kline is wrong. So there is, yes, it's but the whole point of Frame's argument, which I obviously don't agree with, but he's saying that soteriological grace at that point is of the same character as the ontological grace. It's not different. It is the same thing. And or is it, it's blended, whereas Kline would say what we've just put down there, in that it must have a fall. It's demerited. It's not just unmerited. It's something that has nothing to do with ontology in that sense. So I suppose that's the primary difference. So if Kline is if Frame is right, then obviously Kline is wrong. So I think there is an implication for the argument. I don't know. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, no, I get that. In terms of, I didn't realize that Frame was thinking about it in salvific terms as grace before the fall.
Character of grace. He doesn't want to.
Is that because he's thinking of salvation in a kind of neo-Calvinist salvation and creation are highly overlapping things?
I think he just wants to simplify it. I think he just wants to say, there is, what do we mean by grace? It means something undeserved, right. And we're just, that's ontological. That's what it is prior to sin. But that becomes what we mean by soteriological grace when we sin. There's just, it changes character. Now the grace it has in view forgiveness and reconciliation, whereas before it had in view giving the blessedness that Adam would attain to. All of it.
I can see disagreement there. I still don't really see how that is necessarily a blow to Kline's argument, because when you're arguing with somebody else, you've got to take into account the way they're using language and their definitions.
I think if you reject the notion of merit, where Kline is putting the legal aspect forward in the Pactum Salutis, and in the Covenant of Works in Eden, and in the Mosaic Covenant, and there's a typological overlay in Noah and Abraham and David, and so the merit element, the legal element, which is in the foreground, makes intelligible all the covenantal arrangements. And as soon as you lift it and you say, well, you don't need this merit element, you're arguing like a Middle Ages theologian. Suddenly it all goes, and so then Frame reconstructs it without that.
And that's where they're both seeing the problem is. So I think they're right. It's not like it's just a miscommunication or anything. Yeah, good. Right. I suppose on all of that, the one thing we should mention as well, just maybe before, while we're talking about all this, is that, Frame has quite a unique, it's not at all generic Calvinism. Let's put it this way. But he has this idea of the universal covenant that that has nothing to do with the covenant of works one way or another. So that even if the covenant of works is not in operation, the Sabbath promise was actually given to the universal covenant behind the covenant of works, so that the Sabbath structure of humanity is still there no matter what. So that's why it doesn't even
Who's
matter.
the innovator now?
Exactly. I mean, I was reading that stuff thinking, what? This is to even, I mean, he's doing the job of a theologian. I get that. But don't make a big thing out of it, calling it generic Calvinism as opposed to Kline, for crying out loud, who's really kind of by the book on most of this stuff. Sticking to the categories as far as they go. So that has all sorts of implications.
So just coming back to the discussion.
Yes. What did you want to say about merit?
Just the discussion around the merit, because the critique is, if we're totally depraved, we can't merit anything, therefore we shouldn't have merit in the foreground. So
I mean, I think the Augustinian thing it has to do with this republication idea that there could be an echo of the fall in Israel, and that there could be this upper layer of works principle running through the typology, as we've explained in previous episodes, that could show how works merit eternal life, right? And what they although Kline is as clear as a whistle in saying this is all typological, even the type is earned by the blood of Christ in its fullness. So like there is nothing actual that any man achieves by way of merit. I mean, he's very, 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 very clear on this. It's almost like they didn't even read the book, and they just sort of come along and they say, well, no, we're Calvinists. We don't believe in merit. So we're sinners, remember? So, it's a very, very simplistic sort of...
Such a lame criticism.
I don't know. It was a little bit disappointing to see that even mentioned. It sort of... I did mention that along with... This is not Frame. Frame would not do this. Frame knew Kline too well to do this, but a lot of the joining critiques really make
Merit and Moses book, or Moses book,
or a few of them in various ways. I mentioned, like, for example, they talk about the upper layer of typology, right? And they confuse that with the upper register in cosmology or cosmogony, and it's just like maybe it was a typo, I don't know, but did like reread it before you publish it, and it's just and it sounds like that it wasn't a typo. So anyway, stuff like that. It just gives you some sort of indication. They read it maybe once, and now they just want to flatline the whole thing. And
it's odd as well,
reacted to what they thought he was saying.
Very reactive, exactly.
But they do accuse him of being like so hypercharged in his reaction to the shepherd controversy, right?
Yes.
And so you would at least expect them to understand that maintaining the absolute graciousness of grace and sinfulness of man and that kind of thing would be high up on Kline's agenda, and so it would be odd to have such a disregard for it in this. Well,
they even Frame says that Kline sort of has moved in this direction as he was overreacting to Barnson and so forth, and so took a otherwise balanced reformed biblical theology and now has created this antithetical law grace thing to combat Barnson. But as Lee Irons points out, no, actually that's not true, because way before any of that controversy he's publishing on this matter, and so even on that, you just factually, any close reading, it's what I liked about going through this is it didn't take another. You don't have to it didn't take a bout of polemics, to have to work against some of this critique. It was just a matter of going through, no, that's not really true. No, that's definitely not true. No, can't see that, and just putting it forward. Is he saying what Lutherans are saying? Well, I mean, both Kleinians and Lutherans are saying no. There's definitely not a Lutheranism there. It's a dangerous heresy outside the bounds of the Westminster tradition. No, it's not. You've got this minority report running through it's minority report, sure, but that's not a dangerous heresy in Lutheranism. Secondly, Reformed and Lutheran guys have been friends. That's okay.
It's okay.
And no one's freaking out. There's that as well. But all sorts of stuff like that. Just completely. It was ironic because they're sounding the alarm, and calling for the highest response, and yet, in the process are just showing themselves to, just be reactions.
So they didn't understand Kline, and they didn't understand their own tradition, because there were several types of views amongst the Puritans and amongst the Reformed, of which Kline's view is a lot like.
Yes. Yeah, and I like the way that a lot of non-Klinean, like no friends to Kline, would come along and say, no, well, listen, anyone who says that Kline's view is outside of the Reformed kind of discussion on the matter has just clearly not read the Reformed discussion on the matter, because you can't say that. As much as they would want to say that, that's just not possible. Venemer's book on covenant theology, for example, he's just very, very clear about that. It's like the kinds of that kind of statement come from Federal Vision and that sort of thing, where it's just trying to create these extreme polar opposites to make their view, but it's not true. Cool. So Kline's not siding with the Lutherans, but we're okay with Lutherans. What else? There's no.
Well, I think
there's no
the only other
swing
thing that I can think of was because I think we've covered quite a lot of it, but the only other thing was about Frame's understanding of the Noahic covenant as being redemptive. So I mean, I guess that ties in with what we've been saying as well.
I think we've kind of covered that well already anyway. So I think what, I suppose the long and short of it, right, is that as you read Frame on this matter, someone is guilty of a pendulum swing. You start getting clear on that, and someone is reactionary, and someone is, but it just becomes less and less. Someone's holding a generic Calvinism, but which one is it? And I think that probably, it's probably one of the least compelling responses to Kline, in general, even with that weight of argument. Two things. Number one, their attempt to go, listen, if you ever lived the Christian life with a law grace antithesis, or if Israel were living under a republished covenant of works and yet themselves saved by the covenant of grace, they would be that would be a schizophrenic mess. How could we ever do that? But Paul just says that's the role of the law. It's to be our tutor.
The law was added to the promise. Doesn't annul the promise.
This is what we do. The law shows us our sins so that we run to Christ, so we be justified by his grace. I mean, this is, come on, that's not schizophrenia. That's like basic Bible. And then, again, the superficial reading is an issue. And then I think probably what we could have got a lot harder on and could have really got stuck in on is this idea that the whole redemption that Christ wins for us is located in his person rather than his obedience as the second Adam.
Yeah,
I think that is unconfessional. I think you could argue that unbiblical. MacLeod, who wrote that great that book on Christology, says that to argue the idea of merit, that the idea of merit is inherently inadmissible, is to strike at the relationship between God and Christ, which is certainly one of meritorious obedience. There's that. There's again the issue, as Ian says, just as Jesus did not die as God but as man, so Jesus did not obey the law as God but as man. There's all that sort of stuff that we really could have. Because of the impassibility of Christ's divine nature, the locus of his obedience must be considered in terms of his humanity, not his divinity. All of that really important. Could turn that into an episode on its own quite easily.
Yeah.
But I think
could I come back to the merit stuff?
Yeah.
Because I mean, Andre mentioned N.T. Wright earlier, and I do think that this is something that's worth raising, because at the popular level, this is probably the point at which people will very easily sort of write this view off, because it does sound like merit theology. Merit's bad. N.T. Wright criticizes the Reformed view of justification as just being medieval scholastic emphasis on merit, and now we have people throwing merit at Kline's theology. So maybe it would be worthwhile, just unpacking why it's not condign merit, or why it's not putting God in our debt. In what way is Kline talking about merit that it's not true saving merit? So I mean, there's for me, there's a couple of things. So firstly, the whole notion of pactum merit. So the terms of the covenant lay out what God says He's going to reward, and that whole arrangement is a goodness on God's part. So that so here's the nature of God, and here's man who does his very best deed. The best deed of man doesn't equal to the nature of God, but by virtue of this covenantal arrangement, there's a type of pactum merit. So I think that's a broad concept within covenant theology in general, which would undergird, which is necessary to just undergird all covenantal arrangements. That anytime the creature is even able to merit anything, whether it's salvific or even typological, it's by virtue of the covenantal arrangement, as God in His own prerogatives put that in place, that He says He's going to reward it, and He's faithful to that promise. So I think that's one concept in my mind that I think is helpful.
Yep.
The other one is that it's the typological nature of the merit involved. That it's because the obedience is for things like, we're talking under the Mosaic covenant, the obedience is for things like rain, fertility, victory in battle, staying in the land, keeping the enemies out. It's not merit for salvation that Kline is talking about at that point. So when a fallen sinner during the Mosaic covenant does a good deed, we're not saying that he's able to earn his way into heaven. We're not talking old school dispensational.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, to call it some sort of quasi dispensationalist view is ridiculously just wrong. So I think there's definitely ways for us to understand this. And I think the third thing that helps me is what you said earlier, is that basically Christ is the foundation. It's by His blood, it's by His anticipated work that God is relating to these sinners, and sets the whole. Even the typological covenants are set up in light of the mediating work of Christ from the covenant of redemption, anticipating the new covenant. That's the foundation upon which all our works, although works would have been done under something like the Mosaic covenant.
Yeah. And that pactum merit thing, I mean, just to expand on that a little bit, I mean, if anyone does want to look at it, I'm sure we must have talked about ad nauseum Lee Hines' Redefining Merit article. Fantastic, and just showing you the detailed sort of overview there and why Kline's view matters and so forth.
Yeah, 100%.
But yeah, amen. So in conclusion, that last sentence in the chapter, I think, frames unique views and methodology, perspectivalism per se, which we actually haven't spoken about a whole lot. Interestingly, I do speak about it in the chapter though. So, anyways,
no, we have. We've done frame.
We did it last time, right? We've mentioned that, yeah. So his methodology, I think it better explains the opposition to Klinean theology than does Kline's supposed departure from the Reformed tradition. And that's kind of a nice softened, fair, not very humble call there, rather than
in other words, frame's the weird one, not Kline.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Nick. All right, good. Well, that's a wrap.
Just to take away all the softness, just quickly, just rip it out there. Put some barbed wire inside.
Good. All right. So next time we're on to what?
Duovidian response.
No, we've looked at that already.
So because we're working on both sides of the dialectic.
So we're now looking at.
So we've looked at Kline's critique of neo-Duovidianism. Now we're looking at a more in-depth view of the Duovidian response.
Exactly.
Which is why I was reading it this morning.
Exactly. Okay.
So Andre's got the next episode.
Nice.
There we go.
More to come. Good. All right. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Cheers.